Welcome to Bible 504. The title of this video clip is What are the Gospels and How Should We Read Them? In the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament it says, "How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who proclaim good news, who proclaim peace, who bring good tidings, who proclaim salvation, who say to Zion, your God reigns." In the gospel, the kingdom of God is all about your God reigning. And that's what Jesus says in the book of Matthew when he says, "Repent, for the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, is near." And in chapter 5 and verse 17 in that same gospel of Matthew, Jesus said, "I didn't come to abolish and destroy the law and the prophets. Rather, I came to fulfill them, to bring the good news." In the book of Isaiah, again in chapter 61 and verse 1, speaking of the gospel, if you will, the prophet says, "The Spirit of the sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor." In that same gospel of Matthew, in chapter 5 and verse 3, Jesus begins the Sermon on the Mount with the words, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, the gospel is clearly the good news of what God does for his people. The gospel in the New Testament is understood to be the story of what God has done in the person and in the work of Jesus Christ. But what are the gospels as we have them? Well, we think of them as the story of Jesus told in the gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 4 gospels. 3 of them are so similar they're called the synoptic gospels because they view the story of Jesus from the same point of view. They are viewed together, synoptics. John tells the story in a rather different way. But this semester we look at the 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as they are in our Bibles. No, not other gospels, and there were other gospels in the fairly early centuries, but early Christians understood them to be later, in fact too late to be reliable, far later than the eyewitnesses, less reliable, more speculative, non-apostolic, and generally questionable and rejected overall. So the Gospels that were taken were the 4 that we have in the New Testament. Now, what is a gospel? As a literary genre, if you want to call it that, as a genre, a gospel is, well, it's not an epistle. It's not a letter such as we see in the Apostle Paul in his writings in the New Testament. It is not poetry such as we might see in the Old Testament in the Psalms and in Proverbs. It is not history as such as we might see in the history of the people of God following the resurrection of Jesus in the book of Acts in the New Testament. And it is not an apocalypse like we see in the book of Revelation with all its symbols and beasts and animals and all the rest of it. But rather it is much more like an ancient biography. They used to be called a bios, which is where we get our word biology, the study of life. In this case, it's a biography, a writing about the life of a famous person. An ancient biography looked at the words, at the actions, at the life and the major events and the sometimes death and triumph of the hero of the story. Jesus is clearly the hero of the story of the Gospels. Ancient biographies were different than modern biographies in that they didn't look at someone's mother and father and how they grew up and kind of a psychological profile and looking into a very careful, systematic, chronological analysis. It was much more general than that. And so that's what we have in the New Testament Gospels, an ancient biography focused upon the hero, his story, his actions, his teaching, and his mission. So, why is it that, as Irenaeus said, we have these 4 and no more? Perhaps we could answer that question by simply saying, why 4? Well, one of the reasons is they each bring a similar perspective and yet different. For instance, in Matthew, we have the story of Jesus told in rather full form. Lots of use of the Old Testament to line Jesus up with the prophesied Messiah of old. In the Old Testament, passage after passage is quoted in the book of Matthew to show that Jesus is the Messiah. Long discourses of Jesus' teaching, interacting again also with Old Testament messianic expectations. And again, we see in Mark, on the other hand, much more of a focused gospel on Jesus' actions, what it is he does, stories filled with detail of how Jesus acts as the Messiah. In Luke, it seems to be a story pulling together a picture of Jesus as the Son of God for all the world, a gospel more focused on the Gentile world. In the Gospel of John, quite different than the previous three, we see it focused around signs. 7 major signs, climaxing with the sign of Lazarus being raised from the dead, a foreshadowing of Jesus' own resurrection. We see the distinctive Johannine I am, and we find a variety of metaphors with that. I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life. I am the resurrection and the life. These are very distinctively Johannine. Also long discourses in John, such as his long interaction with the woman at the well in John 4. So, perspective, the same and yet unique and valued aspects all put together. Probably the other question is why these particular 4, and it comes down to a question of authority. And I put together 4 simple words that begin with the letter A to help us remember why it is these 4 and no more. Number 1, they have apostolic roots, and they're anchored, therefore, in the first eyewitnesses of Jesus in his life and ministry. Secondly, they were understood by the church to have preserved an accurate record. They were authenticated by eyewitnesses of the gospel. The first 3 verses in the Gospel of Luke talk about that specifically. Thirdly, they are accepted as a reliable record of Jesus' life throughout Christianity. They were accepted by all the churches, not just some in a specific little district, but across the board throughout Christianity. And finally, they were understood by the church to be very applicable to Christian life and profitable for discipleship. So, how is it that the Gospels came about? If that's what the Gospels are, stories of the life of Jesus, these 4, no more, apostolic eyewitness testimonies to what Jesus said and did. How did the Gospels come about? In the book Strauss that we have, he talks about stages of the tradition of the Gospels. And so we'd like to just focus briefly upon outlining those, very briefly. He said that they began with the events themselves in history. Secondly, we moved on to a next phase, which is after Jesus was raised from the dead and went back to the Father. Then the disciples in Galilee began to sit around fireplaces, retell the story to one another. As they traveled throughout the world, they would retell the story orally. And so you have from the events, next an oral tradition in which they would retell the stories. After a while, those stories would gain a certain form. They would tell them again and again in the exact same way. And it got to the point where there's so many of them, they began to make some early written records of what the gospel stories were. Finally, at some point along the way, probably in the late 50s, early 60s, they composed them actually as the gospels themselves that we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So from the events to the oral tradition to very early primitive written accounts to the final composition of the gospels as we now have them. One of the things you will see and you'll hear about is something called the synoptic problem. Again, the synoptics are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These synoptic gospels have one thing that is real clear about them, and that is they are very similar. They begin in Galilee and have a long and extended period of Jesus' ministry in and around Galilee from Capernaum and outwards. Then a couple, 2 or 3 chapters as Jesus proceeds south from Galilee toward Jerusalem. And then a third section in each of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, deals with his time in Jerusalem, and then the passion and resurrection narratives there. So this threefold Galilee journey south, Jerusalem, is something we see as a common format for all 3 of the Gospels. John quite different than them, having many journeys, 3 to 4 journeys back and forth to Jerusalem. Another feature that we see within them is there is a tremendous amount of agreement between the Gospels. For instance, 93% or so of Mark is found in Matthew alone. So They have a great agreement in the material generally, a great agreement in the wording, a great agreement in the order in which the stories are told. Even when there are parenthetical asides, there's agreement in the wording on that, and it really asks us to ask the question, how do they depend upon one another? Are they interdependent? And the answer usually has been yes. The traditional answer goes in two different directions on how the Synoptic Gospels developed. One is a Matthean priority. That is to say that the order we have in the canon is the order in which they were developed. Matthew was written first. Mark as some sort of a summarizing of it, a brief account of it. You might think of it as the Cliff's Note version. And then we find Luke putting both of them together, written at a later time. That held sway in the church for 18 centuries. It was early on, the far and away most common gospel was Matthew, and it was always understood to be first and used most. But in the 19th and 20th century, we began to reevaluate that. And in the 19th and 20th century, many, in fact now, the vast majority of New Testament scholars hold that Mark was the first written, Matthew and Luke came after it. The logic is something like this, that it is far more likely that Mark was written first, to which then Matthew added discourses of Jesus, long teaching sections, and Luke likewise did the same. It seems more likely that you would have expanded a shorter gospel than the likelihood that Mark would have had Matthew and then cut out major sections of Jesus' teaching. That seems far less likely that Matthew would have had a shorter version and then expanded it to include some other information he well knew. That Markan priority hypothesis takes this form. The form is this, that Mark, being the first gospel, existed in its form as we roughly now see it. Then next to it was something that is called Q. There are some stories that aren't in Mark, but they're in both Matthew and in Luke. So stories that were in both Matthew and Luke are called Q, a source that probably existed next to Mark, and it had different material that both Luke and Matthew knew, and from Q. Q is a German word, Quelle, which means source. So if you had Mark and you had Q for material that wasn't in Mark but was in Matthew and Luke, you only had two other possible things going on. You had stuff that was in Matthew and only in Matthew, and stuff that was in Luke and only in Luke. They've titled those M and L respectively. So the four-source hypothesis behind the Synoptic Gospel has those sources. Mark, Q, the material in Matthew and Luke, then distinctive Matthean material and distinctive Lucan material. Four sources for the Gospels. Matthew and Luke, depending obviously upon Mark, Q, and then their respective special source, if you will. Now, when we read the Gospels, something else is important, and that is we know how to read them. I'd like to make a quick note. I know that in Strauss he talked about redaction criticism and source criticism and form criticism, but by far the best way of looking at the Gospels for us is to simply view them as a whole piece of literature. He talks about narrative criticism in his chapter 3, and I'd just like to underline the three features that are most critical there. Number one, plot, characters, second, and then third, setting. The plot is very important, and we see that as the author intends us to respond to the story, he wants to follow it along in sequence. He sometimes will develop characters in a very rounded out way, and so characterization is very important as well. Finally, we see that he lays out settings that often carry symbolic significance. For instance, when Jesus delivers the Sermon on the Mount, it's on a mount. It's on a hill, which reminds one of Mount Sinai and Jesus giving the law. Or in the story of Jesus and the temptations, we see that they occur in a wilderness, in a desert, which reminds us of the desert where the people of God, Israel, were tested as well after the Exodus. Well, those are local settings, temporal settings, and sociocultural settings, and they all go to fill out the story. Plot, characters, and setting, And all of a sudden we take these all into account and we ask ourselves, what did the author intend for a response from his audience? Now, he uses a variety of rhetorical devices that you'll read about as you study in the Gospels and as you read through them. We might think of repetition, parallelism, things called inclusios and intercalation that you can read about in your text. But the final comment I want to make is that as you read through a story, ask these three questions. What does the author emphasize in this story? And emphasis can come from the length in which he talks about something, repetition, its location in the story, grammar, terms, words, emphasis. The second E is exceptional. What is unusual or remarkable in a story? And finally, extension. What has extended value as the story of the gospel goes forward? What does he pick up and talk about again? So, emphasis, extension, exceptional are three things we look for in every story as we look at them. We'll read the gospel this semester and enjoy thinking about those factors as they help us to understand what it is the author intended as a response from the hearer. Thank you.